a Living History production.
I'm Peter Hart, and for the last 40 years I've interviewed thousands of veterans about their experience of war. Join me on a journey through the pages of history. Welcome to Peter Hart's Military History. I'm Peter Hart, and this is my chum, Gary Bain, the sexiest man in North London, we've decided, isn't it? Hello, Gary. What are we doing today, mate?
Well, we're going to be doing Haig, building an army, 1902, 1914.
That sounds dead exciting. Well, it doesn't sound exciting, does it? But do you know what? It's important to understand why is it that so many people try and defend Haig against mass popular opinion? Why do we stand against polite society? Well, I often stand against polite society. Anyway, it's the thing about Haig is it's not just when he was commander of 1st Corps in 1914, or when he's commander of 1st Army in 1915, commander of the whole BEF 1915-ish to 1918. It's not just that. It's not. You see, Can
I just correct you? I think you'll find he was commander of the BEF until 1919.
You are so clever.
Written down.
It's written down just there, is it? If only I could read. The thing is, when you're trying to understand the First World War, I always think, if you want a litmus test, Gary, a litmus test as to whether you're some sort of historian or whether you've got any sort of competence as a military historian, your attitude to Haig is just about, that gives a good indication of whether you're a decent military historian or not. But the other thing is that his pre-war history is like a prism. It refracts light, onto the whole of the British Army because he's so important between 1902 and 1914 to the development of the British Army. He is, isn't he? And you've probably got a song about that as well.
No. No, he is, but he's not alone. You know, you've got Haldane as well, particularly. But he is very important, and we've mentioned in previous podcasts his role in the Sudan and in the Boer War, and he's a developing man.
He's developing,
yeah.
Right.
Some say he came late, but he came.
Yes, I think we'll glide past some of that. He'd done well in the Sudan. He'd done very well in the Boer War. He demonstrated his abilities, so to speak, and he was given a series of appointments, a lot of them staff, but some of them command, over the next 12 years. First, he becomes Inspector General of Cavalry, and that's an important role. Then he's promoted to Major General, something you never were, Gary, and he acts in that capacity as Director of Military Training at the War Office. That's from 1906 to 1907. Then he's Director of Staff Duties, 1907 to 1908. Then Chief of Staff in India, and that is a really, really big job. And then finally, and this is important, isn't it? He's appointed to the Aldershot Command. And you've got a viewpoint on the Aldershot Command. He's made, that's 1912, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's often referred to as the primary regimental appointment in the British Army. Ultimately, it will lead to the command of 1st Corps and the 1st Army. Now,
let's go back to a little bit about Haig, because his military influences, if you like, his attitude to military doctrine, because as he goes into staff, he becomes more concerned with doctrine and organisational things. And he was very, what do you think most influenced him in his military thinking? Was it his visits to Germany? Was it the Sudan? Or what do you think made him, what was his formative influences, do you think?
Well, it was never an original thinker, was he? So he would take others' ideas, but he would be receptive. So once he found something sound, he'd adopt and develop it. So, for example, he was adherent of the standard staff college interpretation that any battle would go through distinct stages. So, for example, initial manoeuvring to gain a tactically advantageous position. The first encounters. Now, this is interesting, a wearing out phase of indeterminate length before one side or the other starts to lose cohesion in the field. Now, interestingly, he wrote to the then Brigadier General Lancelot Kiggle in April 1909, and he said, As regards meeting the storm, which we all foresee, it seems to me that it will last a long time and we will win by wearing the enemy out, if only we are allowed 3 more years to prepare. And then, of course, the Staff College also said the decisive stroke could be launched and followed by the exploitation of victory to the maximum effect. Now, think about that in relation to what subsequently he did as commander in the Great War.
In 1918.
In 1918.
Advance to victory. So for him, it seems to what you're saying, that the Staff College is key to his military thought. He wasn't original. He didn't come up with this. He developed. He basically worked on what he was given at Staff College when he attended there.
But he absolutely bought into it, Peter. This wasn't a view that he followed. He absolutely adopted it.
Now, we're not doing this chronologically. We're doing it thematically. So when he worked as Director of Staff Duties at the War Office, he encapsulates all this in Field Service Regulations Part 1. Which is a sort of manual issued in 1909 by the Army Council. And that sketches out general tactical principles to govern the British Army's conduct in any conflict. Haig's convinced that these basic tactical principles are enough. He doesn't go for the French theoretical approach of sort of they're always, or the German theoretical approach. He doesn't believe much in doctrine, although, and it's a bit tendentious because this is doctrine, really, isn't it? But you've got a quote that's sort of that's hard hitting from young Dougie, although he's not so young anymore, is he? He's younger than us, though. Actually, thinking about it,
he is, yeah. So this is Douglas Haig. While the German General Staff preaches the doctrine of envelopment, and the French General Staff advocates a large general reserve with a view to a concentrated blow at a decisive point of the enemy's battle order, the critics urge that the British General Staff hesitates to publish and to teach a clear line of action. The reasoning appears to be that unless some such definite doctrine is decided and inculcated in peace, action in war will be hesitating and mistakes will be made. The critics seem to lose sight of the real nature of war and the varying conditions under which the British Army may have to take to the field. It is neither necessary nor desirable that we should go further than what is so clearly laid down in our regulations. If we go further, we run the risk of tying ourselves to a doctrine that may not be always applicable and gain nothing in return. An army trained to march long distances, to manoeuvre quickly and to fight with the utmost determination will be a suitable instrument in the hands of a competent commander, whether the situation is to be solved by envelopment or penetration.
So he's eschewing envelopment and penetration as a tactic and keeping an open mind as to each situation as it comes up. Now, the regulations he talks about are the field service regulations, and one of the most important things is that in view of what happens with the all-arms battle, and I'm not saying he looks ahead to the all-arms battle, but this is key to understanding, in a sense, how it develops, is he lays special emphasis on all the component parts of the enemy have to act together in concert on the battlefield. This is the idea of everything has to work together. And I'm going to read this quote. Now, this quote and the others from Field Service Regulations are quite frankly dull. In fact, Gary, I remember you saying to me when we discussed this podcast, and you said, I'll be buggered if I'm reading that boring old tosh. But I think that it's these regulations and the thinking behind them that instead of thinking about people dying on the battlefield and being sad and looking at graves, it's nice to actually think, it's not nice, it's proper to think about how this happened. And this is how it happened. So this is Field Service Regulations Part 1. I'll probably do it in some silly voice, just ignore me. The fighting troops of the army are composed of cavalry, artillery, engineers, infantry, mounted infantry, and cyclists.
Cyclists? I hope they had protective helmets.
These arms are in certain proportions. I tell you, there's a curse on the House of Hart, the Hampstead Building Society, which have been fixed as a result of experience. Each has its special characteristics and functions and is dependent on the assistance of the others. The full power of an army can be exerted only when all its parts act in close combination. And this is not possible unless the members of each arm understand the characteristics of the other arms. Infantry depends on artillery to enable it to obtain superiority of fire and to close with the enemy. That's true, isn't it? Think of the Great War. Without mounted troops, the other arms are hampered by ignorance of the enemy's movements, cannot move in security, and are unable to reap effectively the fruits of victory, while mounted troops are at a great disadvantage unless accompanied by horse artillery, which assists them to combine shock action with fire. Artillery and engineers are only effective in conjunction with the other arms, and all their efforts must be directed towards assisting the latter to secure decisive success. Now, what I notice about this, Gary, is that people say, oh, horses, cavalry, no. But this is 1909. Yeah, the aeroplanes, they're there, but they're not being developed yet, are they? Cavalry are the only reconnaissance means. There's something else about cavalry. They're the only fast-moving thing, the only thing that moves quickly in the whole British Army. They are essential at the time. I could see you wish to come back at me.
Well, I was going to say, that sounds like the lessons, and I think you come on to this, that sounds like the lessons that they took away from the Boer War, where they were against a fast-moving enemy. So it's entirely understandable that they would take those lessons and implement them into the army.
Now, there is one problem about the British Army, and funnily enough, it was in the news. It was in the news yesterday, again, with arguments about the cult of the regiment. Now, you were in a corps, I think, not a regiment, yeah. But the army was in thrall to a sort of cult, and it's like individual fiefdoms. The lieutenant colonel, and you've heard of colonelitis. It even happens in a big organisation like TfL. Someone runs a department, and they move, the next person changes everything. Why? They just change everything because they're new. And lieutenant colonels are buggers for that. And the problem is that the individual battalions, there was little consideration how they liaised together to fight as a brigade, a division or a corps. Certainly not as a corps, and not much as a division. There was no real grasp. You see, a theoretical, Haig can say it in Part 1 of the regulations, but they don't really grasp how to work together, do they? They can't properly coordinate the infantry, artillery and the cavalry because, well, for one thing, there's a lack of training. And do you know what? Britain's not that big a place, and there just wasn't bloody room for realistic large formation exercises. I mean, what do you think?
Wasn't that the same for the continental armies?
No, for the French, partially so. For the Germans, no, there's dirty great big holes in Germany. Well, and not just the ones we've blown it in over the previous 2 World Wars. There's places where they've got the room to manoeuvre, to practice, and that's useful. But there's something else missing in the British Army. Can you put your finger on it?
There was definitely a shortage of trained staff officers, which would allow the constituent elements of large formations to function smoothly. Without that, without staff work, and you've said it again and again and again, without good staff work, which was widely perceived as a dull necessity, and to be avoided if at all possible.
So what do officers want to do, Gary?
They want to do regimental duties. They saw that as the highlight of an officer's career, particularly in time of war.
So better to be a major in charge of a company or a lieutenant colonel in charge of a battalion than to be a colonel, for instance, in a staff job.
Yeah, but which they saw as a sort of office job in the rear. It wasn't at the cutting edge of the army, which is where, in the time of war, they were desperate to be. And we had that. There was a race to get to the Boer War, if you recall. And we mentioned that in a previous podcast. They were anxious to get into the regiment.
And we did a podcast on 1914 about Mons, and one of the things we mentioned was that all the staff officers, all the PSC, past staff college, tried to get it back to their regiments. Disastrous. So this is something that these are things that Haig was unable to sort out. Haig, all the other people, Smith, Dorrie, and the others were unable to sort out. Now there is another and you raised it earlier, and you're quite right to raise it. There's another problem, and that is the confusion caused by the nature of the Boer War and how it. Well, how does it tweaks, it bends. it influences the idea of field tactics. So you take me through it. So what is the problem? Why is the Boer War not a good example for someone preparing to fight the Germans?
Well, the Boer War was far from typical, was it? And if you recall, the Second Boer War, it's almost in two phases. The commander goes back to the UK and hands over to command to Kitchener because he thinks the war's over. And then you have a couple of years of guerrilla warfare where, farmers, and that's what they were, would take the opportunity to hit and move and hit and run. Well, that's not what the Germans are going to do. The Germans, there's a well thought out plan for the invasion of France through Belgium. And practically everybody knows that's what's going to happen.
Sort of. So the Boer War is all about mobility, about being able to cover vast distances. So being able to move things quickly is crucial. But it's short-termism, isn't it? This is a classic case of fighting the last war when you should be preparing for the next war. One thing is, do you think that British officers, we often hear that the British officers have no respect for firepower. What do you think about that? What do you think Haig thought about firepower?
Well, he'd learned by bitter experience, hadn't he? The open ground Boer entrenchments were killing fields. And again, in the previous podcast, we talked about the rifle that the Boers had. It was a decent Mauser rifle. They were good shots. And if you were exposed, you got killed.
I'll tell you another example. And I'm very keen on the Sudan at the moment. The Sudan as well, he'd seen the effect of modern weapons on charging troops. High morale charging troops, but shot to bits before they got anywhere near.
He also understood the effectiveness of the machine gun. Again, we're harping back to previous podcasts. But he visited the Enfield factory. He'd seen the machine gun in operation. It wasn't understood about firing from the side at that time, but he understood the rate of fire.
Now, so let's look at what weapons the infantry have and how. To win the firefight. So it's all about the firefight, isn't it?
Yep.
So what weapons do they have? Well, one of them you've actually fired because tell me about the British rifle. What is it?
Well, it's a 303 short magazine Lee Enfield Mark III, which is a bolt action rifle. It was introduced in 1907, and I fired it relatively recently. It was about 5 years ago, I think, that I fired it. It could hold 2 clips of 5 rounds. It had a very efficient bolt action to load and extract rounds. So if you think about that, that's exactly put it back and it will expel, push it forward, and it will put the round into the breech. And it had a range that reached out to around 2,800 yards, although the field service regulations defined up to 600 yards as close, and you and I have a view on that. We might come back to that. And 600 to 1,000 yards to be effective.
Now, I find this 600 yards business quite so, because you and I have a perspective. We're both sat here. We're allowed to visit each other again. Lovely to see you. But we're both blind as bats, aren't we? At 600 yards, what can you see at 600 yards? Close range. Can you hit anything at 600 yards?
No. So as you know, I play golf. And if you're playing a 500-yard long hole, you can't see the flag. I certainly couldn't. Could I hit it with a rifle? No. I mean, if you think a flag's probably the size of a head, I can't even see it.
It's a long, long way, 600 yards, and the idea of seeing someone at 1,000 yards is quite strange to me. The other thing is, in Europe, we're preparing for a war with Germany. Do you often, when you look out of my house window, can you see 600 yards?
No, and you can very well say to the German, "Excuse me, could you go and stand out in the middle of that field, please?" It's an industrial area. You're going to have housing, factories. Once the artillery starts to come into play, you're going to have rubble and debris and holes. And no, I would think a clear line of fire of sort of 100 yards would be the exception rather than the rule.
So what we're talking about is that this rifle, in a sense, is tooled for the South African wide open veldt, and not so much for Western Europe.
That's a good way of putting
it's still a great rifle, and it's not a disadvantage. It's just that the idea of what is a close range is quite interesting. There is a bit of a cult of marksmanship which goes along with this, isn't there? And we often hear about this. Rapid fire men, they fired. Do you know they fired up to 250 rounds a year, and some fired more, refining skills. They could fire on measured target firing on the range, the long range firing, snap shooting at near and moving targets. And what else was there, Gary? This is the one that we never, ever stop hearing about.
I don't know.
You do know.
I take it you're referring to the famous 15 to 20 rounds per minute. It was known as the Mad Minute.
Now, is this a useful military thing, do you think? On occasion, yes. If someone's charging towards
if the enemy are close, yes. But, of course, if you're firing that many rounds, then you're going to have a problem with the rifle overheating. It's going to get very hot very quickly.
It's not white hot, because that's what they always say. The rifle was white hot. Well, that's bollocks.
Well, you'd also run out of ammunition, wouldn't you?
Well, why would that be?
Well, at the time, an individual soldier would carry 120 rounds in the webbing pockets, and you'd have probably an additional 100 rounds in cloth bandoliers. And
in the initial contacts, that's all you'd have. I mean, it'd be quite difficult to resupply. There are problems. In some ways, better a massive firing, especially at long ranges, if you get long ranges. Anyway, we're just raising this. Now, what else? What other weapons do they have?
Well, of course, the machine gun.
No, hang on. I'm going all wrong.
You're ahead
here.
of yourself. I mean, at the moment, we're talking about the tactics of getting across an open space. Now, this is absolutely taken from the Boer War, and you know they're trying to solve this. So they make initial approaches in widely extended order, up to 10 yards apart. They employ a series of successive rushes at the double, covered by heavy covering fire. This was the fire that allowed the movement. Now, interestingly, I was taught that in the 1970s. You know, that was still being used, 1978, I think. I only did it once, I seem to recall. But it was absolutely the movement forward, kneeling, firing, and the people behind you coming through you, and that was the fire that allowed you to move.
Making them keep their heads, killing them or making them keep their heads down.
Absolutely.
I think that's interesting because often people refer to the fire and movement as an old-fashioned tactic. But what else is there? Fire and movement. Of course, fire and movement is the way forward. I've always found that interesting, and it is, I believe, still taught. I'm sure someone will tell us if it isn't. Anyway, do they have an equal? So that's the attacking part, fire and movement. Is there defensive actions? Do you think they spend much time practicing defence at this time in the British Army before the First World War?
No, there was nowhere near the same concentration on the tactical requirements.
Do they build trenches and practice?
No, they don't practice building
living
trenches.
In them?
I mean, arguably, that's laziness. Because it's hard work digging a trench.
Now, that is a quote, direct quote almost, from Dan Snow's relative, isn't it?
Yes.
Do you remember him saying that?
Yes.
Yes. And you criticised him harshly.
I did. But
you've been led into a trap here, haven't you?
But, you know, it is. And again, I remember digging a much shallower trench in the 70s, and it's bloody hard work. And you've got to have a suitable training environment to do it.
So you can't just do this anywhere in peacetime, and that's another interesting point.
Now you could argue that they concentrated on the offence at the expense of the defence, because if you're not practising it, what happens when you have to do it?
Now, machine guns. We'll come to the Maxim. It was replaced by the Vickers just as the war came on. The Vickers is just a different. I think
it's a variant, really.
I think the lock's just the other way up. That I think is the main difference.
Yeah, I'd like to say actually at this point that the Maxim machine gun was invented in 1884 by Sir Hiram Stevens Maxim. Now he's got a knighthood. That makes him British.
You sure?
Well, he was an American British, but to use the Sir, he has to be British. Now, that was the world's first recoil-operated machine gun, and it's invented by a Brit. American Brit.
We should be so proud that we've killed so many people.
Yes, that's one way of looking
You
at
hadn't
it.
thought I was
I hadn't
gonna say
thought
that.
about that, no. But it, I mean, as an invention, and the suggestion is that the British didn't understand the machine gun or use it to its maximum purpose at the time. But we did.
Allow me to step in with the General Staff War Office Field Service Regulations Part 1.
That's easy for you to say.
It's easy for me to... And this is it. The machine gun possesses the power of delivering a volume of concentrated rifle fire which can be rapidly directed against any desired object. Blimey, even the woman next door. Rapid fire cannot be long sustained owing to the expenditure of ammunition involved. That's interesting because they're thinking about highly mobile things there. They're not thinking about a trench or a defensive environment where you can store up ammunition. And it is therefore necessary that movements and fire action of these weapons should be regulated so as to enable them to gain their effect by means of short bursts of rapid and accurate fire whenever a favourable opportunity arises. Surprise is an important factor in the employment of machine guns, which should be concealed and, whenever possible, provided with cover from fire. I'm thinking of the first VCs of the war here. Where had they concealed that machine gun? Where are D's, Lieutenant D's, and was it Godley?
Well, they're in the front line, aren't they?
They're on the bridge
they're
in
on
full
the bridge.
view.
Yeah, and
So-
it was Dees and Godley.
They hadn't exactly taken all these regulations into account then. And this is part of the... You can write a regulation, you can write a principle, but if it's not employed, it's no good to you.
Well, it's the tactical deployment, isn't it? It's understanding how to deploy them.
Now, of course, I presume the British didn't have enough of these machine guns. I presume we were massively outnumbered by the French or the Germans.
No, we had pretty much the same amount as both the French and German armies. I think it's fair to say...
Two per battalion.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that it wasn't understood that you would attack from the flank. They didn't always grasp that, hence your point about shooting across the bridge, D's sitting at the end of the bridge. It's far more effective firing enfilade fire across because then it's just a killing field for anybody who enters it.
Especially if you have more than one banded together, as the Germans did, whereas we just had our two. And they didn't band the brigades worth together. So why didn't they have more machine guns if they're so fab then? Well, I mean, surely the British government would step forward and provide the army with anything it wanted. I mean, we want 8 and we won't wait with the fleet. What about the army? Did they get everything they wanted?
No, I mean, there is a cost implication, but which I think is the point you're making. But also there was this view that the army would deliver such a concentration of rifle firepower on the defending troops that they'd break through. So it wasn't perceived as necessary because it, arguably is a more defensive weapon than the rifle. And they did have this doctrine of fire and then taking the objective.
Now, I think from what we've been saying, it's fairly obvious that the senior officers of the British Army are at least partially going along with the French cult of the offensive, aren't they? Their battlefield tactics...
well, Wilson certainly did, didn't he?
Wilson, but they believed... What they believed was that they're not fools in one way. Thinking people are fools just because they were wrong is silly. They thought that the modern weapons could deliver such a devastating concentration of fire that nothing could stand up to them. The defending troops would be destroyed or broken and would be overwhelmed by determined troops full of the spirit of Elan.
Yeah, but why wouldn't you think that until you actually engage in a continental war? Why wouldn't you think that? There's no litmus test, as you put it earlier.
And also, one of the things to remember, standing on the defence can be a useful tactic, but in the end, you have to go on the offensive, usually, if you want to attain your objectives. And this is the quote from General Staff, the Field Service Regulations, Part 1. Decisive success in a battle can be gained only by a vigorous offensive. That's not entirely true, but decisive success probably is. Every commander who offers battle, therefore, must be determined to assume the offensive sooner or later. If the situation be unfavourable for such a course, it is wiser, when possible, to manoeuvre for a more suitable opportunity. But when superiority in skill, morale, or numbers has given the commander the initiative, he should turn it to account by forcing the battle before the enemy is ready. ready. Now, in reality, that's just the bleeding obvious, isn't it? I mean, do you not think so?
Well, it's written in a room somewhere, isn't it?
Yeah. But it is true. It's bound to be bloody true. If you've got the initiative, then you should use it. Superior numbers on the battlefield are an undoubted advantage, but skill, better organisation and training, and above all, a firmer determination in all ranks to conquer at any cost, are the chief factors of success. Half-hearted measures never attain success in war, and a lack of determination is the most fruitful source of defeat. This is explaining a lot about Arsenal's recent problems. Do you think they knew? A defensive attitude at the outset of a battle should not be assumed except when it is advisable to gain time or to utilise advantages of ground for some special reason, e.g. to compensate for inferiority of numbers. I find that a statement of the bleeding obvious, but not attuned to what would happen.
No, I mean, there is some truth in it, isn't there? But
well, you can't manoeuvre in a trench battlefield. You can't manoeuvre to get a better situation if you're in...
Well, they've not taken any account of the devastating power of bolt-action rifles, machine guns and artillery fire deployed from covered positions. And they're facing an equally well-trained and motivated force. For example, the Germans. So you know you're going to be fighting an equally, if not better, trained army.
And there's no flank to turn, is there? Trenches from the North Sea to Switzerland, there is no flank. There's no suitable opportunity.
No.
It's going to result an attack over open ground. What do you think will happen to it? Slaughter. That's what's going to happen. Well, I don't know. Do they come to terms with this?
Well, slowly. I mean, arguably, the first 2 years of the war are the period where the British certainly are slowly coming to terms with it. And it's not because they don't understand the modern warfare. It's just exactly as you've described it. You know, the arguable race to the sea. That wasn't a race to the sea. Nobody wanted to get to the sea. They just wanted to get round a flank. And that was fast disappearing. Once it disappeared, painful.
Are your flanks disappearing?
My flanks are getting bigger, unfortunately.
Oh, no. Anyway, so enough banter. That's a sort of juvenile remark that loses us listeners. Are you aware of that? Anyway, bugger off listeners who don't like juvenile remarks. That's what I say. Where are we? Well, I think we'd better turn to the Royal Artillery. Were they well set up for a modern sort of Western Front style war? What do you think, Gary?
No, again, learning the wrong lessons from the Boer War. Colenso, for example, the guns had been exposed and taken by rifle fire. They'd taken the lesson that you wanted smallish, mobile guns. So the British guns were more akin to the 75mm, for example. They didn't understand that they would need big, heavy guns, and it's the wrong lesson for a continental war.
And as at Colenso, they kept putting them too close to the front line.
Yeah. And
so wrong guns placed in the wrong
place. There is
is
a need for field guns, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that there isn't, but it's not the primary weapon in a continental war. So,
and did they learn from the other big war that we're not going to talk about it much, but there's another war going on that people forget about, including me often.
Well, they killed somebody from Hull. I think they sunk a trawler from Hull. The Russo-Japanese War in 1904.
Was
I can't say
that for Hull?
Russo-Japanese. No, but a whole trawler was sunk. I think it was the Russians mistook it for a Japanese.
They were sailing all the way around. Probably got sunk at the Battle of something. Now that had shown the importance of counter-battery fire. Did we take note of that lesson?
No.
People pointed it out here. So, funnily enough, you know who was the official observer? Have a guess.
I have no idea. Was it Admiral Jellicoe or somebody?
Ian Hamilton. You've heard of him?
Oh, I've never heard of him.
I'll take you to Gallipoli sometime.
Yeah, that'd be nice.
Right up Gallipoli. Right, now, after the Boer War, I think the Royal Artillery, it's still locked into the wrong tactical perspective, isn't it? It's looking to direct fire from the guns. Now, what do we mean by direct fire? You can see what you're aiming at. Not over a hill or 4 miles away. You can see who you're shooting at.
And that's important. It's close support of an infantry attack. That is important.
Or to repel an enemy attack.
Absolutely.
Now, what's the prerequisite for guns they want? We've said this, but let's just hammer it out.
Well, mobility. That's the lesson they took. That was the prerequisite.
They
Otherwise,
had to be able to keep up.
They couldn't keep up otherwise, you're quite right.
Now, so heavier guns would be slower? Yeah, of course they bloody would, because they're heavier. You need more, they're more difficult to build. So there's a bias towards light field guns with gun carriages. So what gun do they settle on? In 1904, they settle on a gun. And do you know what? It's a fantastic gun, isn't it? People often say, why don't we have the 7.5 or the 5.9? But I think the 18-pounder is a fabulous weapon. Describe to me, Gary, what the 18-pounder's like.
Well, that was a positive lesson taken from the Boer War. They decided that they needed a more effective gun, and the 18-pounder or 84mm was decided upon to be the main artillery piece. It was fantastic. It was a quick firing gun, pretty up to speed technology-wise, and upon firing, the gun recoiled within a buffer case, which then slowed down and stopped before returning to the original firing position by what's called a recuperator spring. So
you didn't have to relay it every time you fired it?
No, the gun carriage didn't move. Static.
So what rate of fire could they get with that?
I think it was up to 20 rounds a minute. I think that's going some, but
I'm not. I think up to is the word.
Up to is the word there, yeah.
So what range we're talking?
Well, it's about 6,500 yards. That's comparable to the French 75mm and the German 77mm. It's a good gun.
What about, did they have any howitzers at all? Now, howitzers we've talked about before, and everyone listening to this will know what they are probably. It's a high trajectory gun. The shell goes up and over anything in between and drops down and plays with you. So what do they get a new one of them as well?
Well, they had what's an excellent gun, a 4.5-inch howitzer, which is 114mm, I think, in modern parlance. And it was first brought into service in 1909, a range of 7,300 yards, capable of firing up and over obstacles that would, frankly, they'd stop a flat trajectory of a gun. And it had a firing rate of 4 rounds per minute.
That's less than 20.
That is less than 20.
My math said, finally, it's sort of equal to a challenge.
Yeah.
I'd say it's 16 rounds less.
Do you know what? I'd say somewhere between 16 and 17, because I'm also not convinced you would get 4 rounds off. Yeah,
absolutely. I'm not convinced you get 20. So these are guesstimates, I think. We had enough of these guns. We've got about the same number of guns per division as the French and Germans. But there's something we don't have. Now, the first thing is, you want to say that about real heavy guns, don't you? Because the one thing we don't have is mobile heavy howitzers. Now, the Germans had a lot more of these, but they also had super heavy howitzers and guns, didn't they? And you want to just mention this because it's a sign of the Germans thinking ahead a bit more than us, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the Germans thought about this a lot in the pre-war years. They took a much greater interest in the capabilities of such weapons. Now, that's probably because they were thinking about the Belgian forts, frankly, and they saw them as vital to break down permanent or temporary field works in order to restore the mobility to the battlefield. Now, I'm going to talk about the Big Berthas. You know, everybody thinks that the Big Bertha
they're not a battlefield weapon.
They're not, but everybody thinks there was a gun called Big Bertha. It wasn't. It was a class of gun. It was designed in 1911, produced in 1912, and there were 2 available when the war started in 1914. Now, they were actually 42mm Kursa marine cannon, variant, I think, 1AL12, and they were made by Krupp. They were huge.
42 centimetre.
42 centimetre. What did I say?
Millimetre. Well, never mind.
No, I think it's 42mm.
No.
Oh, it must be centimetre.
That would be smaller than the 75mm. If you see what I mean.
Yeah. That's true. You with maths, me with millimetres. What did I say in Gallipoli? Hill 921 was 921 yards.
Yes, that was a little bit. It would have been a mountain.
It would. Anyway, but the Germans take a different view.
So they've got not only the super heavyweight ones, which are for a function, but also useful for smashing things like the Verdun forts and things like that later on. But they also have lots of long-range howitzers that are in between there. Now, why are long-range howitzers, long-range guns so important?
You mentioned it before, counter-battery.
And this is something that's super important and wasn't realised really by the British until late 1916. We never really get our eyes onto this. And our guns, if they've got a range of 6,500 yards, well, there's no man's land. We can hit the German front lines. It's difficult for us to hit their guns. So we're in trouble before we start. Now, are the gunners well trained? Gunners are usually well trained, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, the training that they received was excellent. It's not a question of training. The simple skill levels were good.
So they could load and fire the guns, drop into action, that kind of thing. They're good at that.
Yeah, whether there was a real understanding of the more arcane elements of gunnery, that probably wasn't understood and would come much further on in the war.
So the officers and specialists are lacking in some of the gunnery skills. Let's just summarise these quickly. They don't have a grip of the techniques required for accurate indirect fire, where you can't see the target. They're not properly understood. So were the maps accurate and surveying techniques, were they up to any of that?
No, they were too inaccurate. They didn't allow for shooting off the map, certainly not at that stage, by estimating where exact location ranges and angles were.
Do you think they knew about calibrating guns because to allow for different barrel sort of wearing rates of wear? Have they got a grip of that?
No, I don't think that was a consideration at all.
Do they understand the importance of meteorology? Now, I didn't for a long while, but changing barometric pressures, heat, these things affect it. Did they understand that?
No, I mean, this is sounding more and more like science, isn't it? Like, having the modern artillery certainly have a full understanding of the science of artillery, but at that time it wasn't properly understood.
I think the Royal Garrison, let's go into this, because the Royal Garrison Artillery, I think they do understand it. But what about the Royal Horse Artillery and the Royal Field Artillery? They're not really up to it at all.
No, I think that the concept of registering an invisible target from a concealed gun position lay in a frankly glum future when mathematics and science, as I've mentioned already, had overwhelmed the gentlemanly pursuit of warfare.
So it's not beyond the science they had, it's just that a lot of officers weren't bothered with it.
No.
So I remember interviewing an officer who said an old major told him, if it's cold, cock her up a bit. But that's not accurate enough. You need to work things out scientifically. Now, the Royal Artillery, what about the shells they're equipped with? I presume they had a full range of shells.
No, I mean, they're pretty much relying on shrapnel. Again, wrong lesson taken. And there was a distinct shortage of high explosive shells.
So that would be great in the veldt.
Absolutely great.
Troops in open.
But what do you need for trenches?
High explosive.
High explosive. Buildings?
High explosives.
Covered gun positions?
High explosives.
Yeah.
So, actually, the other thing about the Royal Artillery is they had no idea of continuous fire, sustained fire, did they? Now, did you think they have to fire a lot in the First World War?
Well, certainly towards the later stages, they could easily have to fire 500 rounds in a single day. And it's a well-known fact that there was a shell shortage in 1915.
Well, there was shell shortages in late 1914 and always onwards because they just don't have any, they don't have the shells because they weren't expecting it. I think the Royal Artillery is badly off the pace. I'm not criticising them in one sense, it's just that they're not prepared for the war that was coming at all.
No, and if they were fighting on the plains of South Africa, it would probably have been perfectly suitable for that terrain.
Now, what about cavalry? There's lots of trouble about cavalry in the pre-war, and there's lots of people arguing. There's Roberts, who supports mounted troops. That's Field Marshal Roberts, who I think is a bit of an arse in many, many ways. But there's lots of... you see, the people all will point to Haig and Lord French, Earl French, what's his name? Field Marshal French, as he became, John French anyway. They point to him and they say they're cavalry generals and criticise them there. What were the role? Gary, just quickly go through what the cavalry were for.
Well, let's think about the primary role, reconnaissance. You know, you mentioned yourself, the aircraft were in their infancy, tanks were a long way away at this point. They had the role of feeling their way forward, carefully probing to determine the movements and strength of the enemy. Otherwise, the infantry are blindly walking into that.
Now, before aircraft, that is the only means of doing it. So what else?
Well, they're acting as a screen, aren't they? They're trying to prevent the enemy getting the self-same intelligence that they're trying to get. And again, the aeroplane take over that role in the future, but they're not there yet.
I think it's interesting because we do that. Funnily enough, the cavalry do a brilliant job of this compared to the Germans in 1914 campaign. Now, what else?
Well, there's the bold raid into deep into the enemy's territory.
That's not going to happen. That's irrelevant, isn't it? But they didn't know that, did they? But that's a big part of their thinking, isn't it?
Yeah, well, that would have been designed to have a negative effect on the lines of communications and whatever's in the rear echelon. So support headquarters, any field support, artillery support, anything behind that front line.
And they've done a lot of this in the Boer War, haven't they?
Yeah, absolutely.
And what else? Well, it's the old real function of the cavalry. What is it, Gary?
They're the shock troops, aren't they?
Why are they so shocking?
Well, they were described as the arme blanche, weren't they? They were capable of charging enemy formations and shattering the cohesion. It was this last thing that triggered the most controversy about, we did podcasts about Waterloo and the heavy cavalry charge. Can you imagine standing and taking that sort of charge?
But the trouble is, against quick-firing artillery, machine guns and bolt
action... Oh, you wouldn't worry
rifles,
about it at all then, would you?
You just shoot them to bits, especially if there's what else? What else has come into battlefields recently?
Barbed
wire, Gary.
You've got barbed wire, you've got machine guns, rifles, but the barbed wire, the horse wouldn't willingly run into the barbed wire.
Now, so what's Haig's position on this? Because he's got a nuanced position, hasn't he? And nuance is a good word because it's to do with some of these historians who criticise Haig having a bit more of it. So what does he? What does the intelligent cavalryman? What are they after?
Well, he didn't want to lose the option of a charge, but he understood that they would be there to ensure that any charge would be covered by intense fire from the equivalent weapons in an attempt to prepare the way for success. So they wouldn't be doing it on their own. That's the first thing. He didn't see them, careering off into the sunset towards the enemy, but he didn't want to lose the chance to break the morale of an enemy by inflicting the terrific kinetic impact.
What does kinetic mean?
Well, it's the same as a big horsey hitting man.
It's like punching the nose, is it? Which I'm going to get if I
You're
try.
You're going to get that if you try that again. I might have just said it means Ian Hamilton.
So now they think they'll lose the offensive spirit. That the cavalry will go to ground when they see the enemy, and instead of doing something. I think. What is the end result, Gary?
Well, let's just ponder for a moment. It resonated with me when we were looking at the Boer War that Haig had a particularly dismissive view of mounted infantry during the Boer War. So he saw the cavalry as the all-round soldier. So he didn't just see them as being, part of a charge. He could see them dismounting and fighting as infantry.
And why didn't he like the mounted infantry? I think it's basically just because he thought they were crap at
everything. He didn't think they were good enough. He didn't think they were well trained in any aspect. They didn't look after the horses properly, so the horses were not as fit as they might be.
They couldn't ride
well, and they couldn't shoot well.
Couldn't shoot, so when they got off the horses, they were rubbish. And could they cavalry charge? No. So really, he just felt they were rubbish at everything.
Yeah, so you end up with a compromise, which was pretty sensible, I suppose, which was the regular cavalry would be trained for all eventualities, and therefore they'd be capable of performing a full range of roles.
And that's how it worked out in 1914 as well. They are some of the most valuable troops on the Western Front, filling gaps. They had more machine guns relatively.
Didn't they just wait behind on their horses?
Don't start, Gary. They were crucial to the defence in 1914. Now, what about air? There's a lot of mental agility. They're talking about cavalry, but simultaneously they're also thinking about the air, aren't they? And the first aeroplanes, when have they gone into the air?
Well, they'd only fluttered into the air in 1904.
Fluttered? Do you mean fluttered?
No. But there was already much interest in the military potential. I think they'd been used in some of the military exercises.
Is this just aeroplanes, or is this?
Well, no, they're thinking about effective bombing, the use of machine guns to strafe troops from the skies, and the technology's a long way from that.
But they're thinking about it.
But they're thinking about it.
But the real thing they're looking at is
reconnaissance.
They're using both aeroplanes and airships, and everyone goes on and on about 1912 and Haig losing a
leg.
A leg? No, not losing an exercise they had, a big exercise. It's a big annual exercise. But in actual fact, it's because he trusted the reports he got from his reconnaissance too much, which is quite interesting because he did, and hence lost to Grierson, General Sir James Grierson, who was his just about the same age as him, and he lost because he trusted and he hadn't seen his aircraft hadn't seen something. This is quite typical of Haig. A point that should be made: he always over trusted modern technology and modern methods sometimes, and this is a sign of it. One sign of him was they had trials of aircraft in India, and he actually recommended that officers go back for training. They hadn't made much progress. The progress comes with war, because war is a catalyst. We've talked about this. So let's try 1914 aircraft aerial warfare one to hear more about this. They'd begun experimenting on aerial photography, observation of artillery fire, blah blah. But they hadn't got very far before the war started.
But they were also thinking about how do you disguise the troops from the eyes in the sky.
And I think the advice Grierson or Snow gave was to pretend to be mushrooms.
Grierson was a fine figure of a man.
He had a figure very similar to yours. What happened to Grierson?
He died.
Now, our last phase that we want to talk about is the assembly of the troops for a war. How had that gone in the Boer War, Gary?
Well, it hadn't gone particularly well, although we mentioned that by the end of the war, some 400,000 plus British troops had passed through South Africa. You've got to think about the logistics of the time. It's not only the gathering of the troops, you've got to move them. All of the armies were reliant on the railways, particularly the continental forces, and railway timetables were the only real way of getting people around. So you've got to think about the British. Recruiting in Britain was voluntary. We didn't have conscription, so we had a very, very small army. Men joined the infantry for a minimum of 7 years with the colours, and then they were on a reserve list for 5 more, which would mean they'd be liable to be called up in the event of the war.
And they were in the...
Yeah, and they
So was this adequate for the Boer War?
Well, it was adequate for the Boer War, but only in the sense that it was over time. It wasn't immediate.
Well, they had a lot of ad hoc responses, didn't they? They called up a lot of reserve troops.
Yeah, and certainly I think at the start of the Boer War, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the British were outnumbered something like 3-1 by the Boers at the start of the war.
And then we call up various, I think amorphous bodies would be the term I use if I was being intellectual. Militia, yeomanry, volunteers, they're all called up. And the Boer War stretched our military resources to the limit. And so the regulars had done well, in a sense, but there weren't enough of them. So what to do? Well, bugger all's done at first, isn't it? Until you get the Liberal government in 1906. And you, Gary, are a Liberal, as we all know. And step forward Sir Richard Haldane, the Secretary of State for War. He's an important man, isn't he?
Yeah, I mean, he and Haig are very different people. I mean, Haldane is a confirmed bachelor.
Nothing wrong with that, Gary.
He was described as being married to the law.
I'd be a confirmed bachelor if I wasn't married.
Yeah, I mean, he was a Scottish barrister practising law in England and described as married to the law. He had a sybaritic nature and social life.
Did you have to look that up, Gary?
I did look this up. It's fond of sensuous luxury or pleasure, self-indulgent.
Gary, this is you.
Well, he's definitely the opposite to Haig, isn't he?
Yeah. Now, what was Haig? So he was Secretary of State of War. What is Haig?
At this time, he's the Director of Military Training.
So he's going to work hand in hand with Haig. Now,
Absolutely.
is Haldane welcoming? How does he try and deal with army officers? Army officers are different from Sybaritic pleasures.
Yeah, well, he makes a distinct attempt to get everybody on side right from the start, and this is typified by his initial meetings with Haig, and they got on famously right.
Now
from
you've got
the
a
start.
quote from Haig. It was a miserable bugger, but this is a funny quote.
Yeah, so Douglas Haig says, Mr. Haldane is a fat, big man, but with a kind, genial face. Once seemed to like the man at once. I had 2 walks with Mr. Haldane, before and also after lunch. He seems a most clear-headed and practical man, very ready to listen and weigh carefully all that is said to him.
Now that's good. It's a good politician. That sounds excellent. Now the army is then, it was, as you've said, county-based regiments, 1 battalion overseas usually, Gary.
Yeah.
Somewhere in the Empire. One
Mostly
at home.
India, to be fair.
Yeah, mostly India. One at home, which sort of sent drafts out to the serving regiment. So the reserves were generally below strength. Sorry, the home battalions below strength. And really a recruiting organisation. So how would you get an expeditionary force of 6 fully equipped manned divisions to go off to France, as Wilson and Foch were duly planning at this time? How are you going to get it without denuding the empire or abandoning the home defence?
And bear in mind, it's against a backdrop of no increase in spending from the government, and in fact, there's some reductions in the overall budget.
That applied to the Navy?
No, I think it was just the army.
Yes, the Navy is the priority, and it's worth remembering at all times during this talk. Haig and everybody is fighting against the complete dominance of the Navy when it comes to spending.
The senior service.
The senior service. So if there's money to be spent, they get it. We want 8, we want 8. That kind of thing's going on. Now, what's Haldane's solution? There's a mishmash of volunteers, yeomanry and militia. What's he going to form?
Well, he rationalises all of that. It becomes the new Territorial Force.
Ooh.
Now, that's responsible for the defence of Britain, but the intention was to provide an additional force, when they're properly trained, which could be deployed overseas in times of war, subject to the men volunteering.
And that worked. That worked well. Yeah. Now, what's Haig's role in this then?
Well, he's got to pull all this together, isn't he? He's got to put all the details of the new system, and he's got to resolve any snags or problems that arise.
Now, we've got another slightly amusing thing. Haig goes to visit a medium, now, a spiritualist medium. He was told to do this by, well, she was obviously a complete dipstick in many ways. His a gullible sister, Henrietta. If you believe in spiritualists, you are a complete knobhead. And the incredulous Haig, who didn't, I think this is great and a sign of the wonder of Haig. He asks the medium whether the spirits had any cogent advice as to whether the new Territorial Force should be organised on a company rather than battalion basis. And in the reply, the spirits seemed to have plumped for the company option, which of course Haig didn't. But then there's more to follow, because the medium says that she's being guided by no less a figure than Napoleon Bonaparte. I hope it was Bonaparte the first, not one of the idiot offspring. Have you got idiot offspring, Gary? I have. Anyway, perhaps I think Napoleon may have had a bit too much time on his hands in the afterlife if he's listening to this medium and answering questions about company structure. So you've got a wonderful quote. And Haig's obviously taking the piss here.
It was in my power to be helped by him for good affairs, but I might repel him if his influence was for bad, though he had become changed for better in the spirit world. I was destined to do much good and to benefit my country. Asked by me how to ensure the Territorial Army scheme being a success, she said, "Thought governed the world. Think out the scheme thoroughly. One's thoughts would then be put in so convincing a manner that the people would respond without any compulsion, and the national army would be a reality." She could not bring Napoleon to me, but I must think of him and try to get his aid. as he was always near me.
This is just bollocks, of course, but that's just an amusing sideshow, and I do like the fact it's in books about Haig, that this ludicrous conversation with the medium. Now, you can't leave things to the spirits. Well, possibly gin.
Or whiskey in Haig's case.
Yes. And Haig presses on. It's not the spirit world, it's hard graft if you're going to turn the concepts that Haldane had come up with Haig into a reality. Were there any objections to this, do you think?
Well, of course there were.
Who from, Gary? Who would object if the spirit world say?
Well, you've got the bastions of privilege within the militia and volunteer forces. You mentioned it yourself, the structure of the regiments and the colonels. You've got supporters of subscription. Lord Roberts poured scorn on the scheme, questioning the military worth of a part-time soldier.
Oh, dear.
Some of that still happens today, of course.
Well, why didn't they have conscription again?
Well, it was against the British psyche to do that. And as you mentioned, it wasn't the senior force. It was felt that the Navy protected Britain's interests and that the Army didn't need to be that.
So they don't want to pay the huge sums that would be required to have a large conscript army like France or Germany.
It wasn't perceived as necessary. Didn't need it.
They're also worried about whether territorials, as they would be called, could be given artillery role. Of course, that they could, and they were. But so Haig perseveres, press on, and the end result was the Territorial and Reserve Forces Act of 1907. Let's go through what this does. You start, Gary. What does it do?
Well, the structure that it creates is 14 regional-based infantry divisions.
Now, that's on top of the 6 that they need for so this is huge, isn't it?
It is.
What else?
Now, they've also got 14 cavalry brigades, all of which have the associated artillery, medical and logistical units.
So they're building up a proper divisional structure here. This is good. What else does it establish?
Well, it establishes a special reserve. Now, under this, men could enlist as special reservists. Put my teeth in. Special reservists. And after 6 months basic full-time training, which was usually with the 3rd Reserve Battalion of the regular regiments, it'd be topped up by annual training periods, and they'd be eligible for call-up for a period of 6 years.
Ooh. And another thing they did was an officer training corps. And that's crucial when you expand the army to have all these, the kids from, I'm afraid, from public schools, who'd been given, they passed their Certificate A, and they were ready to take on military service.
Why are you afraid of kids from public schools?
I'm very frightened of them. They have... I don't know.
It weren't just public schools, was it? Universities as well provided a steady source of young officers.
Had the people at university been to public school before they went to university?
Yes.
But officers' training corps are useful if you need to create a massive officer corps. Suddenly, it's all part of it, isn't it? So, as you said, they're not originally intended to serve, but I think let's make the point. When does this territorial force become useful to us?
Well, it becomes really useful in the winter of 1914 on the Western Front.
Back end of winter, when the 1st battalions start to show up on the Western Front.
Well, they all volunteer, don't they? You know, they can't go by all. I'm not talking about all the individuals. All of the regiments volunteer.
So a large proportion of the lads do say, yeah, I'll give up my life, literally.
Yeah.
And off they go. So that's a crucial thing. And so therefore Haig is not only a general on the Western Front, he's also the man who was responsible for creating the Territorial Force, which sent people in. What training they had? They'd had drill nights, they'd had weekend training, and they'd had their annual camps. It was a good start. It pushed them on the way, and after 2 or 3 months after the war started, they were able to start being deployed to the Western Front. It's crucial, isn't it?
Absolutely. Now, it wasn't just the lads who needed training, was it?
No, well, you could see that from the performance of some of the bloody generals in the Boer War.
So
and what else was there a shortage of? We said it before, shortage of staff officers. So what happens?
Well, it makes it clear the Boer War, it's evident that more training is needed for commanders, senior staff officers, and the creation of a fully functioning permanent general staff.
Now, Haig doesn't do this. I want to make this quite clear, but he's all for it. They in September 1906, they create a general staff, and there's a G branch at the War Office. That's in Whitehall. And so this has got the Directorate of Military Operations. That's broad strategic and operational planning and associated intelligence. The Directorate of Staff Duties. That's the definition of war established. So they decide who's going to be where, staff training and training manuals. That's what Haig was in. And the Directorate of Military Training, covering home defence and training of troops, and that's also what Haig was. So these are some of the posts Haig was involved with. But Haig is responsible for one thing, and that's the creation of the Imperial General Staff. Why is that important, Gary?
Well, you've got to bring troops from particularly New Zealand, Canada, Australia, which are self-governing dominions, and the whole process has to be done without interference. And he works out how to do that.
So basically, it's a structural reform that's that would be vital in deploying the forces of the Empire to assist the British in the Great War, and that's part of Haig's work. Now, the other thing we want to talk about is Haig had 2 stints in India. One as something of the cavalry. I've already forgotten what it was. He was Inspector General of the Cavalry in India, but then the most important thing was from 1909 to 1912, he's Chief of Staff India. Now this is, again, absolutely crucial. Why is it crucial? Well, what does Haig do, Gary?
Well, he's at the heart of the reforms that facilitate the creation of an Indian expeditionary force. Now, bear that in mind, expeditionary force. So he took a stiff broom to the bureaucracy that clogged the system. And
have you got a stiff broom, Gary?
I have. Now, Haig himself enjoyed quoting a fine example of the civil service style circumlocution.
Ooh.
Continuity of policy is not sacrosanct against diversity of circumstance.
It means...
it means bollocks.
It's just bollocks. I mean, what it means is you don't... if things change, you change your policy. But why not just say that instead of, And Haig took that was something Haig used to love quoting, wasn't it?
It was. And now he being the man he is, he took simpler procedures, encouraging direct lines of communication between officers to lay out clear alternatives and to define a coherent policy.
And that's a staff officer. I often think of Haig as being the supreme staff officer. A good commander, a good general, but he's a great staff officer. He truly is.
He is a fantastic staff officer. There's no doubt about it. And arguably it was his strength up until that time.
Now, he also does something that really affects the Western Front in 1914. And this is something dear to your heart because you feel this contribution is often unrecognised by certain people. Tell us what it is.
Well, he did this in total secrecy as well. He had plans produced which defined in every detail, meticulously, the dispatch of an Indian expeditionary force to fight alongside the BEF in France.
Now, that's big.
That's huge.
Now, it culminates with a 1911 a staff exercise. They ran through the whole process. So it's not just a plan. They have an exercise to check it. They've also got contingency plans for expeditions to Mesopotamia and East Africa, and they happen. Now, how did the political masters respond to this?
Well, Lord Morley, who was the Secretary of State for India at the time...
He must have been delighted.
Well, he discovered what was happening and basically it frightened him. The very idea of Indian troops serving outside of the borders of India. And he ordered the immediate destruction of the plans.
So this is I don't like to use it, but this is basically that you can't have foreign troops fighting in our brave European battles. It's just sheer racism.
Yeah. Now, Haig took immediate notice of what he was told, and the self-same plans duly reappeared when they were needed.
So he put them in a drawer marked, "Do not open except for war."
Yeah, and then they miraculously appeared, these destroyed plans.
Now, is this important to the story of what happens in 1914 on the Western Front?
Yeah, the Indian contribution in 1914 cannot be understated. Overstated. It was critical to what was happening on the Western Front, and they get there in the late autumn of 1914.
and part in time for the later stages of the race. And Ypres, and well, they're just a little bit nearer Neuve-Chapelle and Messines edge, but they are crucial. And Haig is responsible for these people arriving. This is crucial. Now, the last thing we're going to talk to, and we might edge into this in the next time, is that Haig was promoted to Lieutenant General. And in 1912, he was given the Aldershot Command. Now, you think a lot about this. We mentioned it at the start, but the Aldershot Command is important, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a crucial important. He's now responsible for the preparation and training of the 1st and 2nd Divisions, which would form the 1st Corps, which ultimately is under his command in the event of war. Now, his performance as a general in command of the 1st and the 1st Army will be subject of a later podcast. But I just want to talk about the Aldershot Command, if I may.
Yeah, of course you can.
So it was often referred to, as I mentioned, as the best command in the Army. And with apologies to the 1960s play Oh, What a Lovely War and the film of the same name, Haig was a bit of a slow starter, but he then leapfrogged many of his seniors, including Sir Hubert Plummer, and Sir James Grierson.
We were only playing leapfrog.
Exactly.
We were only playing leapfrog.
Thank you for that. Excellent.
We were only playing leapfrog.
Finished?
Yeah.
Excellent. He followed Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien, who himself had followed Sir John French, so we were only playing leapfrog is pertinent. Now, there were some practical considerations, and I'd like to do a final quote, if I may, from Douglas Haig of some of the domestic as well as financial considerations of a general officer at that time.
This is just fun, isn't it?
This is just fun. So Douglas Haig says, Smith-Dorrien wrote to me privately about taking on his furniture and carpets, etc. at Aldershot. Rather a big order. I have written to him, but my sister will go and have a look at the things with someone to act as my agent when she returns from Canada. But I have a good deal of furniture stored in England, so in any case I don't want to take all SD's things. Personally, I think Government House ought to be kept furnished by government, just as the Lieutenant Governor's houses in India are state property. It is difficult for general officers to collect a mass of furniture for 3 or 4 years without losing money over the sale of things when their time is up.
I just love that. And it's interesting because Haig is not a wealthy man. He's barely minor landed gentry, as one of our good friends would say. He's commercial. His father is from commerce, and he is not rich. The money isn't flowing down, is it?
No, and Smith-Dorrien's trying to flog his gear on to recover some of the costs.
These are not
I feel
rich.
very sorry for the general officers.
I feel very, very sorry for them as well. Now, why is it so important? He is in command of 1st Corps. There is no 2nd Corps. 2nd Corps is formed at the start of war and is to be commanded by General Sir James Grierson, who dies, and of course Smith-Dorrien, Horace, is it? Yes, sir.
Yep.
He takes over command at short notice with hardly any staff, trained staff, because who's got all the trained staff?
Well, it would be Haig.
Yeah, because 1st Corps is established. It's an incredibly important command, and Haig spends the last 2 years before the war beating it into shape, exercising it, putting through his general precepts and exercising in the manoeuvres which includes the one where he slightly buggered it up because of the aeroplane mistake. But and that's preparing for war. But this is what we were saying. He is the prism through which you look. You look at the preparations of war. His fingerprints are all over it. Now, the last thing I want to do. We've overrun a bit today, but I think it's been worth it. It's important that. Haig is important before the war. I want to mention our twin podcast. This is done by our good friend Matt McLachlan, or McLachlan, as he would prefer to be called, and Pete Smith, or Peter Smith, as he'd prefer to be. And what have they done, Gary? Because it's a good thing, isn't it? They've formed the Battle Walks podcast, and they're every week. and they take a different battlefield, look at the battlefield, and talk about it. It's not dissimilar in some ways to our podcast, but they're looking as these two guys are experts at the battlefields they've visited, and they take on a sort of virtual tour of it. And I think it's absolutely excellent. I urge all our listeners to give them a listen. It's Battle Walks, and it's found on the Living History website. Okay, well, that's it for today. Or do you want to say anything about
I would just add that if you do listen to it, and if you listen to our podcasts, a review would be useful. We encourage people to review both ourselves and Matt McLachlan's podcast, Battle Walks.
And there's two main things. Apple podcasts are a great place to review it. People see it there. It doesn't seem to be seen so much on some Spotify. But the other thing, of course, is our new Facebook page, which is Military History Podcast Reviews. It's unimaginably
Trips off the tongue.
It does. It does trip off the tongue. And you can review it there. Review either one of ours or anybody else's. There are lots of great military podcasts, but particularly Battle Walks. Don't forget the name. Okay, well, nice to see you in my living room, Gary.
We'll meet again.
Don't know where.
Don't know when. See you next Thursday.
Oh, yeah. Cheers.
Cheers, Pete.